Yes, my Alpha, Vibrant Violet. Chapter 3, The High Seas Part 2 by Bottle 7. Hubert settled in for the night, swiping an oversized shirt of Sloane's to sleep in. As expected, the Alpha woman's scent lingered on the shirt, and as expected, she smelt of the sea. It was almost as if, down to the very essence of Captain Myers' being, she belonged on the waters. The steady rocking of the ship sent Huey into a deep sleep. Within the coming days, Huey settled into his new life on the Rose Marie. Days were slow. He was surprised that, overall, things were pretty relaxed on the ship. There was a clear pecking order, but even those who did grunt work weren't afraid to voice their opinions. Huey found some of his time ended up being spent with Bella and Winnie. The stoic Alpha woman often showed him how to do different things on the ship. Winnie typically did much the same, with a bit of color commentary to go along. She loved to gossip with him about other crew members. Huey found it educational and a great way to pass the time. As of right now, he wasn't able to do much in the way of his actual work. So helping around the ship is what he could do until then. There was some struggle to get used to walking, and sometimes he got sick from the rocking of the boat. But he was looked after pretty well when he couldn't do much for himself. For a couple of days, he was particularly sick to the point of being unable to leave his room. On the second day, Sloane turned up in his room. "Mr. Hubert?" She called, opening his door after giving it a couple of taps. Hubert curled up on his bed and noticed a bottle in her hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Captain?" Hubert questioned weakly. He wanted to appear cheeky or coy, but he just felt sick. Even his normally fiery red hair was a duller hue than normal. He just felt awful all around. Sloane opened her mouth, getting ready to say something flirtatious or even witty, but she took a brief moment to give Hubert the once-over. "It appears you're in no state for pleasure, Mr. Hubert," she said in a softer tone as she walked over. She sat on the edge of his bed as Hubert sat up. He then saw, as she set the bottle on his end table, what it was. "Here to wine and dine me?" "That might be a bit of trouble. I can't keep down my lunch," he joked weakly. Sloane chuckled in response. "Maybe some other time, Mr. Hubert," she replied, using a knife to pop the cork. A fizz came from the mouth. Hubert asked, taking the cup. "Wine and wormwood, Mr. Hubert," Sloane replied. Hubert then took a sip. It was sweet, and he swallowed. "A bit of a warning, if you have any stowaways, you will make them walk the plank, so to speak." Hubert had just downed another gulp. He looked at her wide-eyed. "I'm talking about parasites, Mr. Hubert," Sloane said frankly. I got that." Hubert stuttered out. "I will do what with them now?" he asked, wondering if he was going to be in more pain. He did not do pain. He hated pain. "You'll be releasing them," Sloane replied frankly. "It's a great way to keep the girls healthy, if you ask me. Not every port has the cleanest of foods," she mused, mostly to herself. Hubert was about to set the cup aside, but Sloane grabbed the cup. A sound of disapproval came from her lips. "Come now, Mr. Hubert, we can't have you sick as a dog. The girls miss your pretty face," she cooed, gently grasping his chin. "Me more so than the others, if I'm being honest," Sloane added with a coy smirk. "Now be a good boy and drink for me, will you?" she purred lowly, holding the cup to his lips. Hubert chuckled dryly and held her wrist, pushing it away. "I drink this. You'll have to take responsibility for me, Captain," he replied. So you want old Sloane to nurse you back to health?" Sloane asked playfully. "Don't think it'll be so fun, Captain. I can be very demanding." Hubert threatened with narrowed eyes. Sloane's good eye crinkled and she grinned slyly. "I think I can handle it," she said confidently, before adding, "But don't complain when you find you like being kept by me, Mr. Hubert." She hummed. "What, going to put me in a cage like Diego?" Hubert asked, again with the locking up. "I'm beginning to think you might like to try it." Sloane laughed. Hubert let go of her wrist and he drank the rest of the wine. "That's a good boy there." She praised pleased. Hubert gave her a side eye at her purposefully using such a phrase. Sloane just smiled innocently and recorked the bottle. He thought maybe she'd have him drink more, but it seemed that she had other plans. It's best not to give you too much, Sloane remarked, apparently seeing his confused expression. I could handle it. Hubert mumbled softly. He felt his eyes feel a bit heavy from being tipsy due to the wine. A light drinker are we, Mr. Hubert? Sloane questioned. Hubert's eyes closed. He drifted in and out of sleep as Sloane carried him to her quarters. While things were blurry, Hubert had vague fuzzy memories of being sick. All through it he remembered Sloane being there with him. When he woke, he sat up slowly on Sloane's large bed. He was dressed in a fresh oversized shirt. His skin felt clean as if someone had wiped him down in his sleep. He hissed slightly, feeling sore as he moved from the bed. The steady rocking of the ship didn't seem to make him as sick as before. He looked around the quarters, seeing Dago was fast asleep in his cage. He headed for the door, stumbling a bit as the ship climbed what felt like a mountain. Grabbing onto the door handle, he pulled it open just as the ship went down the other side of the mountainous wave. This change in direction caused Hubert to stumble and he ran face first, just the waves. He stumbled out a vague explanation. He had wanted to go back to his room to get some pants. Or at least he thought. His mind was fuzzy at the moment. Sloane leaned down, feeling his forehead. You're still a bit flushed. She mumbled, scooping him into her arms. I'm fine. Hubert tried his best to insist, if only to soothe old Sloane's nerves. Could you please take just the tiniest of naps for me, Mr. Hubert? Sloane asked with a pleading smile. Hubert felt exhausted still and he nodded, feeling his eyes grow heavy. Now that's a good boy, you get your rest, Mr. Hubert. He heard Sloane say, clearly pleased, before he fell asleep once again. As night time fell, Hubert woke up from a brief nap, seeing the sleeping form of Sloane across the room. Her feet were propped up on her desk and her jacket had been used as a blanket while her eyes were covered by her hat. Soft, calm breathing was heard coming from her despite the steady rocking of the ship. Huey slipped out of the bed, making his way over to Sloane. He approached slowly, unable to walk much faster due to his still groggy state. Lifting up Sloane's hat, the alpha woman's eyes opened slowly. Huey was met with the sight of Sloane without her eye patch. She had a scar across her eye and it was hazy. He was going to invite her into bed, feeling bad for hogging it to himself, but he ended up staring at her eye. Mr. Hubert? Sloane asked, blinking a few times. Hubert cupped her face, running his thumb across the scar near her eye. He wanted to ask what happened, but he doubted Sloane would tell him. He smiled slightly, remembering her comment about needing mystery to compete, as if he was some sort of prize to win. Hubert hardly ever felt worth fighting for. All someone had to do was ask nicely enough and he'd follow them to bed more often than not. It isn't fair for me to hog the bed to myself, Captain. He said, smiling slightly at her. If you can keep your hands to yourself, I'd be willing to share. He teased, says the one touching me. Sloane slipped her feet off of her desk as she said this. What is a little bit of petting too much? Sloane chuckled softly. Huey leaned close and kissed her cheek. Thank you, he said softly as he pulled away. What for? Sloane asked, looking surprised. You took care of me. Sloane grinned slyly at him. But of course, Mr. Hubert. She gave him a nod, before standing up. She cracked her back and stretched a bit. It seemed as if some parts of her went numb from sitting there for too long. I have a question. Huey leaned against her desk for support. By all means, Mr. Hubert, ask away, Sloane said, hanging her hat and jacket up on some hooks on the wall near her desk. Why do call me Mr. Hubert rather than Huey? He questioned. Sloane grinned at him over her shoulder and then turned to face him. If my memory serves me as well as it has, you said everyone calls you Huey. I thought I ought to set myself apart a bit. Sloane eyed him with a playful look on her face. So while everyone calls you Huey? She approached him, and Hubert was lifted up in her arms. "I'm the only one who calls you Hubert." Sloane leaned close and pressed her forehead against his. "Fever's gone down," she remarked, looking pleased. "Why in the world did I get a fever?" Hubert asked, frustrated that he suddenly got sick after drinking wormwood wine. "Well, it could be the change in climate. Some of the girls when they first join get sick." "Have you ever been outside of the Northern Isles before?" Sloane questioned. "Do I look like the sort who usually travels?" Hubert replied, "I don't know, are you?" Sloane questioned as she walked over to the bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed, kicking off her boats, and then moving into the bed. Hubert climbed off of her and made himself comfortable. "Now stay on your side, Mr. Hubert. I have my innocence to protect." Sloane teased. Hughie rolled his eyes and lay down. "Sure, Captain," he agreed, not wanting to bicker too much. Sloane smiled, finding his agreeance amusing as she laid down across from him. "Sleep well, Mr. Hubert," Sloane said softly. "You too, Captain." Hughie chuckled before closing his eyes. When morning came, Hubert felt better and left for his room. He only slipped on a pair of trousers over his nightshirt, finding that he didn't mind the smell of the captain lingering on him. Days passed, and as fun fantasies of being constantly desired on the ship were. Hughie was both frustrated and relieved that wasn't the case. Aside from brief flirtations, most crew members left him alone. It seemed that, unlike his experience with alpha men, women seemed to know when to stop. No one actively tried to woo him even when he acted vaguely interested. Something that would usually send alpha men swarming like foxhounds on the hunt. Hubert wondered if it was because everyone thought the captain would be upset. But after about 3 weeks on the ship, he realized that it wasn't that they were afraid of the captain. Instead, it was simply because most of the crew was very gay. Flirtation between alpha women happened often, and terms of endearment were traded regularly among crew members. He often heard names like darling and love leave the crew members' lips as they made eyes with each other. Many of the women were good-looking couples and seemed happy, though there were a few unexpected couples. Bright, bubbly personalities paired up with stoic ones. Angry personalities were with people that seemed almost saintly in nature. Among the 100-head crew, it really was about 25 women that Hughie had his pick from. Technically 23 because of Darcy being happily married and Sloane not being as picky as she got drunk. Though Hubert had yet to see Sloane actively attempt to woo anyone else just yet. Though if he got really technical, it was about 22, while Winnie was obviously interested. Hubert wasn't interested in someone who was clearly too young for him. He attempted to let the young girl down easily. Aside from some general complaints mostly said for the drama of it, Winifred seemed to take the rejection in stride. But if he really thought about it, was actually 21, despite Bella being interested in men. She had made it plain and simple by directly stating that Hubert wasn't her type. When he asked why just for the fun of it, she replied simply, "You're just a bag of bones. How would you be able to raise any child looking as scrawny as you do?" Hughie could only reply fair enough in response. He wasn't exactly sure how to respond otherwise. Then again, it was probably 19. Hubert stopped himself and sighed. He sat up on his bed annoyed. "If I keep this up, I'll disqualify everyone," he mumbled to himself, rubbing the corners of his eyes to clear them from sleep. He slipped out of bed and got dressed, tidying himself up with a brush swiped from Sloane's room. Hughie tilted and turned his head, trying to get a good look at himself in the small mirror that hung on his wall. Taking just a brief moment, he smiled slightly, realizing just how many things he had just taken from Sloane's room. Several shirts at this point had been swiped. He would swipe trousers as well, but Sloane's waist was much bigger than his. It was quite amusing to him how generous the captain had been with him. He had expected her to be throwing more gifts or sweet words at him soon enough. Alphas tended to do that whenever they wanted to lure him into their beds. Though, Hubert wasn't sure if he'd mind too much being in Sloane's bed. The captain had proven to be excellent at the art of flattery. Hubert would be lying if he said he hated the extra attention Sloane paid to him when she got the chance. Though it was only when she got the chance, the last few days they had only seen each other in passing. Sloane was a busy woman running a ship, so Hubert had to make do with busying himself. He had tried to make do in a fun way, but again, no one seemed willing to go so far with him. Letting out a sigh of frustration, he walked over to his door, opening it. It took a moment to process someone standing there. Captain. Hubert looked up at Sloane, who was just in the middle of going to knock at the door. Ah, Mr. Hubert. Sloane dropped her hand and smiled at him. To what do I owe the pleasure, Captain? Hubert asked, eyeing her up and down. She was wearing different clothes than what she normally wore on the ship. Finer and more well taken care of. Was she trying to impress someone? I just came to notify you we're about to make landfall in 2 hours, Mr. Hubert, Sloane said with a smile present on her lips. That's so. Hubert replied, a grin spread across his. What are you going to buy me? He asked in a teasing tone. Sloane's polite smile faded and amusement twinkled in her eyes. Hubert grinned just a bit wider. He loved going back and forth with her. To be honest, he had kind of missed doing it whenever she got too busy. For your pretty little smile, Mr. Hubert. Sloane stepped into the room. She closed the door behind her. Once it clicked shut, she turned back to him and tilted his chin with just one finger. I already told you, she leaned close, whatever you want. She said softly, gazing into his eyes. I'm going to bleed you dry. Hubert chuckled, gazing at her with half-lidded eyes. That's so. Sloane's hands moved, cupping his face. We've got 2 hours, Mr. Hubert. I wonder how we could pass the time. Sloane flirted shamelessly. Hubert grinned, just about to lean close to kiss her when there was a knock at his door. Both Sloane and Hubert let out groans. They met each other's gazes and both seemed amused with each other, judging by the smirks they gave one another. Sloane turned and opened the door. How on God's green earth did you figure out I was here? There at the door stood Darcy, who seemed nonplussed about the situation. You mentioned going to look at something pretty. The other day you said that Hubert was the prettiest thing on the ship. So I put 2 and 2 together. Darcy deadpanned. Although Sloane's back was turned, Hubert snorted when he saw her flinch. Such a mouth on you. Do you go around spilling every secret that enters your ears? Sloane hissed through her teeth. Darcy stared at Sloane cluelessly. What? Darcy asked, clearly confused. Sloane sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. What is it now? She asked. Andrew's here. Darcy remarked, glancing over at Hubert. Did I interrupt something? She seemed to piece things together. Darcy. Sweet Darcy. Sloane seethed. I love you like a sister. Please. Let's go deal with Andy. Sloane was annoyed but managed to keep her cool. Hubert, ever curious, followed Sloane and Darcy above deck. Expecting to see maybe another merchant's ship or something to that effect, Hubert was surprised to see the Navy here. The flag of the new kingdom waved proudly above the crow's nest and a board was placed across the decks of the ships. Captain Sloane Myers. A man wearing an admiral's regalia walked proudly across the board. He was a large man that appeared to be an alpha. Admiral Williams. I see sucking on the king's rotten cock hasn't killed you yet. Sloane replied with a sharp tone of malice. Hubert snapped his head in Sloane's direction, surprised she'd be so bold to say that. If anyone else said that, they would be hung. Admiral Williams snapped instantly. Any ruler who cannot stand to be the subject of ridicule should step away from the throne. Sloane sneered with folded arms. Why are you here, Admiral Williams? Darcy questioned, stepping in. Why are you letting the slow-witted one speak? Admiral Williams questioned, glaring openly at Darcy. Within an instant the relaxed expressions of the women on the ship sharpened. Mrs. Darcy has more wits in her little toe than what you have in your head. Sloane spoke gently, leading Darcy to stand behind her. "It's fine, Captain, he's just upset about last time." Darcy looked relaxed despite the fierce glares on Admiral Williams' face. "You were counting cards," he accused. "Shuffle faster." Darcy replied instantly with a frank tone. "Darcy." Sloane sighed, shaking her head. "You and your card games. I've stopped since I've gotten married." Darcy defended herself. She looked away with folded arms. "I didn't want to worry Liam," she mumbled softly under her breath. Several women chuckled hearing her, and Darcy was patted on the back by one of the crew members. "Williams, what do you want?" Sloane asked. "I'm here for inspection." Williams replied with a grin. "Oh, you want to rummage through our things?" Sloane asked, folding her arms. "Damn. I guess I can't do anything about." Sloane rubbed the back of her head before looking at her sleeve. "Oh, what's this?" she asked comedically, pulling out a rolled-up piece of paper from her sleeve. "Oh wow. An order from the Crown," she exclaimed as if shocked as she unrolled it. However, Williams pulled out his own order. "I told him about the rotten cock remarks." Williams sneered, grinning at Sloane. "Well, if he didn't whore around with dozens of nameless paramours, he wouldn't have to worry about button scurvy." Sloane deadpanned. "I knew we should have started working for the Empire." Winnie grumbled and sighed. "Make it quick," she sighed, waving Williams off. Williams began to motion for his men to come over, but then Sloane grabbed his arm. "But stay away from my room and the one closest to it," she warned. "Or else what?" Williams asked snidely. Sloane glowered. "If you want to be introduced to Davy Jones, by all means, Admiral. I'm more than happy to help you make that connection," Sloane threatened. "Are you looking to get hung, Myers?" Williams threatened with a furious sneer. "There's a reason why I have the papers I do, Williams," Sloane replied calmly. Williams stared at her before clicking his tongue and looking away. "Fine," he spat before he and his men began to work their way through the ship. Hubert stepped aside with Sloane. Some of the sailors saw Hubert and grinned at him. "Pretty cabin boy," one alpha man remarked. "A bit old in it, he." Another chimed in. "He's our tailor, not a cabin boy." Bella spoke up with folded arms. "We're not perverts like you lot." Winnie snapped, glaring. "A bunch of fecking deviants you lot are." A third woman chimed in, glaring. All the women on the ship glared openly at the sailors. There was clearly bad blood. Hubert felt a hand resting on his shoulder and looked up to see Sloane glancing down at him. "Let me know if their eyes wander too much, Mr. Hubert. I'll gladly gouge them out." Sloane joked, clearly annoyed by the Navy's presence. "Sure, Captain." Hubert agreed, moving a bit closer to Sloane, disliking the lecherous looks he was getting from some of the sailors. While he never minded a little extra attention, it felt like the attention these men would give him was the sort that he wouldn't always be willing to receive. It was clear from the feeling he got under those men's stares that between the Rose Marie and the Navy's ship, Hubert would much rather stay on the Rose Marie. The search took about 20 minutes, and a dissatisfied Admiral Williams climbed above deck with his men annoyed. "It's clean," he complained, glaring at Sloane. "I tell you the same thing every time. I run a clean ship, Admiral. I carry the supplies I report in my manifest every month." Williams grumbled in response to Sloane's retort. Hubert swore he heard something that sounded like "filthy pirate" before Williams let out a growl and shouted, "Let's go." He shouted to his men and they all slowly left the ship. The aftermath of Williams's crew searching the ship was a mess. The only two rooms that remained untouched were Sloane's and Hubert's. The captain had no issues with helping the girls clean up, taking to sweeping up broken bits of glass, remarking that she would storm the palace and cut the king's head off of his shoulders for this. If it was anyone else, they'd be killed, Darcy mumbled in passing as Hubert joined in on cleaning. Hubert glanced over confused before looking back at Sloane, getting the feeling that her ability to make such comments was a part of her mysterious background. After cleaning, it only took a short time before they made landfall. Making port in the city of Gritstone, Hubert quickly realized that this was the same city where Laken and Hadley had stayed for a short while. He looked around, hoping for a moment he'd be able to see the familiar face of his best friend before remembering that the last letter he got told him they had just arrived in Emerald City. A slight pout formed on his lips. He had longed to gossip with Hadley like they used to. Sloane made her way down the loading ramp with Hubert, and he glanced up at her. What, thinking of batting those pretty eyes to get something a little extra? Sloane teased, looking to be in a better mood now that they had made port. Well, now that you mention it. Hubert responded with a grin on his lips. Sloane laughed, shaking her head. I have to fill out some paperwork. We can ruin my financial situation in just a few moments, Mr. Hubert. Sloane promised just as Darcy walked past them. I'll take care of it, you two go on your date, Darcy announced. Hubert looked to Sloane to make a flirtatious remark before he saw a faint flush to Sloane's cheeks. Liam thinks you're just a helpless little thing. You do well at hiding those damn claws of yours. Sloane grumbled, adjusting her hat. Darcy grinned at Sloane before looking at Hubert. Don't let her get drunk, she warned before turning away to go deal with the reports for Sloane. She won't be able to afford a pint, Mrs. Darcy, I can promise you that. Hubert grinned ear to ear, grabbing Sloane's hand and dragging her behind him. He wasn't sure where exactly he was going, but Sloane seemed perfectly fine with him leading the way. Hubert grinned to himself, sure that he'd bankrupt the captain before the Rose Marie left port.